Good evening everyone and welcome to an Aussie Cyclone Chasers Cyclone video update tonight, the 8th of April 2014. My name's Chris Nitzo and a special good evening to our 2,000 new followers over the last couple of days. We hope you're finding the information we present here relevant and useful. Tonight our main topic of conversation will obviously be Tropical Cyclone Ita. It is now severe Category 3 Tropical Cyclone and is starting to push towards Queensland. It is expected to eventually make landfall somewhere in the vicinity of Cape Melville on Friday afternoon, and after that, though, we tend to see a lot of model disagreement as to what it will do. So we have a number of different scenarios, and we'll go through some of those through this broadcast. Firstly, we'll take a look at the Bureau of Meteorology track map for the next 3 days for this system. We can see it's Category 3 now. It's being impacted by some land interaction here with some islands off the PNG and also some of the more mountainous coastline here in the extreme southeastern tip of PNG, creating a little bit of friction and a little bit of perturbation or disruption in the wind flow into the system from the west and northwest. Once the system is clear of that landmass, we should see continued intensification of the tropical cyclone. We're hoping that by tomorrow, by possibly tomorrow afternoon, we'll see a pretty decent eye in the system. We can see it's pretty symmetrical, so there's no real asymmetrical system expected to hit land, so we're seeing the potential for some strong winds to the north as well as the south. Normally a lot of the time in the Queensland systems particularly, we tend to see a fairly stacked southern side system. With this one, it appears as though at this point in time it may be a little bit more symmetrical than what we're used to. So the system expected to track in a west-southwest direction now all the way through until just before landfall, where it starts to push in a more southwesterly direction. Now at the point of landfall is where the model's variations really begin. So up until this point where it hits the coast, we're pretty set, we're pretty sure it'll do it. We're not positive because you're never going to say you're positive for a Coral Sea system, but we are pretty sure that it's going to get at least within 100 or so kilometres of that coastline before starting to do some silly things. We see the Joint Typhoon Warning Centre track very, very similar over the next 3 days. We see a coastal crossing just slightly to the southeast of where the Bureau of Meteorology put it, but exactly the same time frame. So Friday afternoon, 4 PM is where it makes initial landfall. Category 4 tropical cyclone. So we're looking at the JTWC predicting wind gusts of up to 240-50 kilometres an hour at the time, and a very significant tropical cyclone with sustained winds, possibly up to 1 minute sustained winds up to about 180 to 190 kilometres an hour at its initial impact. Now, I guess this is where we see a lot of variation now. See, the Bureau of Meteorology track then continues the system out here to the west before pushing it south and then southeast out here as a weak low. Now, the Joint Typhoon Warning Centre track does that recurve a lot quicker. So we see that the recurve happens right on the point where it hits the coast, and the system tracks right along or near the coastline, either east or west of the coastline. It's too hard to say at the moment. And if it is east of the coastline, the system will continue to be a tropical cyclone as it pushes down towards Cairns, Townsville, and then eventually Mackay before pushing back out to the Coral Sea. It's unlikely to get closer or further south than Mackay, purely and simply because once we get south of Mackay, we have some very strong upper level westerly winds which will either shear the system away or will push it well away from the coastline in a more east-southeast to southeast direction. So there you go, folks. Fundamentally and in a nutshell, in the first 4 minutes of this broadcast, we've told you what we expect to see happen. We expect to see an initial landfall at the Cape Melville region, whether that's just north, whether that's just south, in the end, it doesn't make that big a difference. We're talking about an error margin of possibly about 100 to 150 kilometres at landfall, which is quite good at 3 days lead time. So Friday afternoon, Category 4, and in the vicinity of Cape Melville. So that is what we're expecting. Now, obviously, what happens after that, very interesting but extremely diverse set of model guidance for that. So there's very little confidence in any of these scenarios, either the Bureau of Meteorology's or the Joint Typhoon Warning Centres. So let's have a look at what Ita looks like right now. So on microwave imagery, the tropical cyclone Ida is not looking all overly flash. Certainly for a Category 3 cyclone, it's not one of the ones you'd put in a textbook just yet. However, once again, remember it is being impacted by these islands here to the southeast of PNG, plus some mountainous terrain here on the southeastern tip of PNG. Can't be helping the situation either. We do see on the microwave imagery here, we do see some pretty nice banding coming into the center of the system, but overall it's not what you'd call a textbook cyclone just yet. Here's the latest infrared imagery. We can see some very cold convective cloud tops here, and that is always a good sign that the system is quite intense. We can see that these cloud tops are around about negative 80 degrees, which means they are towering high up into the atmosphere. And because of that, we're getting some very strong, very deep convection, and obviously the system is showing absolutely no signs of either peaking in intensity or dying anytime soon. We were trying to find an eye earlier today on the visible imagery. It was so difficult though, and it is very difficult because we have such really strong convection all over the system itself. If there was an eye, it's likely to have been located somewhere in this area here, right over the top of this little island here. But at this point in time, there is no visible eye on the system. Looking at the current wind estimates, we can see that overall, as I said, the Bureau of Meteorology expects the system to become quite symmetrical according to their forecast track map, although at the moment it is quite an asymmetrical system. That means that we see the southern half of the system much stronger than the northern half of the system. The north, particularly this northwest, remember as I said to you, the mountainous terrain here of PNG is really creating a disruption in the flow from the northwest into the system. So we've got a very weak northwestern quadrant. However, over the southeast, southwestern quadrants, so the southern semicircle of the system, we're seeing some very strong winds, 50 knots plus sustained winds there. So we look at the oceanic heat content for the next 12 to 24 hours. The system's going to be lying in some very warm waters. The waters do get a little bit cooler as we head further to the west towards the peninsular coastline, but they will not be cool enough sufficiently to limit intensity of the system. So the waters here are well and truly supportive of a Category 4 or 5 tropical cyclone. It is not too late in the season for that. Obviously, if it can get into the Gulf of Carpentaria, so if it continues to push west, and this is on the basis of the JTWC forecast, if the BOM forecast or the EC forecast tends to do better and the system pushes way out here to the west into the Gulf, we see some even better conditions in the Gulf of Carpentaria, some really hot ocean temperatures there, and also some really good upper level conditions possible in there too. So we could actually see, if the system makes landfall and pushes into the Gulf, we could actually see even more rapid intensification than we're seeing currently over the northwestern or northern Coral Sea. If we look at the amount of moisture in the atmosphere all along the track here, there is absolutely zero problem with the amount of moisture in the atmosphere itself. So the atmosphere is moist enough to sustain a strong tropical cyclone, sustain the convection of a tropical cyclone for the entire duration all the way through to the coastal crossing. So all in all, over the last 6 to 12 hours, we are seeing, or starting to see, just the development of that west-southwesterly track beginning here now. And as I said, overnight and tomorrow we should be seeing the system finally start to develop a little bit of an eye feature, a much better eye feature, as it heads away from this coastal landmass here and this island area here that it's currently located on top of. So let's take a look at the 5-day track forecast model by model. We can see now not the JTWC, the GFS model from America has the system hitting the Cape York Peninsula just to the north of Cooktown, pushing right along the tropical coastline of Queensland all the way through to Mackay before starting to push offshore. This particular track will be devastating and very damaging for most of the Queensland coastline from about Mackay northwards, because the current track guidance from the GFS suggests the system will remain right along or just off the Queensland coast. That means the area of maximum winds will occur along the Queensland coastline, all the way from Cooktown south to just south of Mackay Serena probably. So folks, this is not a good scenario for anyone, and the system here is category 4 on impact, and because it remains right along the coast, it actually remains very intense on its track through. So for instance, a place like Townsville could be experiencing the sort of winds that they experienced from if you remember Tropical Cyclone Yassi a few years ago. Those sort of category 2 to category 3 intensity winds are a possibility if this track verifies. So folks, this isn't a great scenario for anyone on the Queensland coast. It becomes very difficult for us to chase it as well as Oz Cyclone chasers, because we get to Cooktown and then the chances are we can't really follow it back down here because it's too dangerous. So we would end up having to make a decision as to whether we get the initial landfall or whether we get landfalls further down the coast. So it's quite a complex pattern for us as well. So this is the GFS scenario. Now I'm going to show you the polar opposite. This is the European scenario. Now the European consistently comes out at number 1 in terms of cyclone prediction, in terms of model guidance. So if we look at it here, the system is expected to adopt a west to west northwesterly track over the next 12 to 18 hours, and then adopts a west southwesterly track all the way to landfall around Lockhart River. Now from Lockhart River it pushes west and exits the western peninsula coast just to the south of Weipa, reforms into a very significant tropical cyclone in the Gulf country, and in the longer term will push southeast and through inland parts of Queensland and wash out over here in central inland or northern inland Queensland. That is the expected track from the ECMWF. The NavGem model is not a very accurate model, but it also verifies the GFS solution with a Cooktown crossing of a category 2 or 3 tropical cyclone, followed by a more inland option as it tracks to the south and southeastern recurves. So this one recurves it slightly west of the coast. Now that's a much better scenario for the coast of Queensland, because it means that the system will drop to below cyclone intensity, or at the very worst category 1 cyclone intensity, as it heads down the coast. A very similar type of situation, I guess, to an ex-Oswald, which crossed here and basically just tracked right down the coastline of Queensland. The No Gaps model, or the NavGem model, now has that very same type of scenario happening. Now, obviously, if you're in the southeastern quadrant of that system, as it tracks here, and here, if you're in the southeastern part of that system, you need to be very careful for some very intense rainfall and the possibility of those isolated tornadoes that we saw with ex-Oswald. The same type of meteorological structure and meteorological dynamics, I should say, are present for this particular system. CMC model, the Canadian CMC model, same thing. The system pushes west, makes landfall just to the north of Cooktown, pushes west a little further inland with the CMC model, and then exits the coast around Townsville, and then continues southeast away from the coast. So we do have that recurve scenario. Now look folks, in this recurve scenario, we need to mention the threat and potential for some very, very heavy rainfall anywhere to the south and east of the system. So we can see here that it crosses just to the north of Cooktown, so anywhere sort of Cape Melville or even as far north as Cowan southwards, we'll see some extreme rainfall from this event, especially as the system starts to track further to the south and then starts to exit the coast again and re-intensify slightly. We'll see some very heavy rain south and southeast of the cyclone centre. The experimental FIM8 model, much higher resolution than the GFS model, suggesting a very similar track, coastal crossing to just north of Cooktown, pushing inland a little bit and then exiting the coast around Townsville. And once it does that, obviously once again, same thing as I said for the other models, we do need to be mindful that to the south and southeast of the system centre, we will see some extreme rainfall and some gale force winds, possibly even storm force, destructive winds as the system exits the coast again. The UK Met, interestingly, has a much slower track. So the initial track and the coastal crossing still happens on Friday on the UK Met, but after the coastal crossing, that recurve is really, really slow, and the system ends up actually washing out here over northern inland Queensland or the southern peninsula at days 4 and 5. And what we actually see is just a general area of moderate to heavy rainfall anywhere from about St. Lawrence northwards all the way to where the system washes out. So this is a huge rain producer over a large part of the Queensland coast, and because of its slow movement will result in major flooding over the North Tropical Coast and Tablelands and the Herbert and Lower Burdekin and possibly even the Central Coast with Sunday River systems. So this is one that, while it may not be quite as a dramatic scenario as the GFS model, which continues with a Cat 2 or 3 TC down the coast, this one has the potential to create some record-breaking April rainfalls. The Bureau of Meteorology's Access G model, we can see 24 hours time the system lies just off the southern tip of PNG, and then in 48 hours time the system pushes west. In 72 hours time on Friday morning the system is stalling right along the coastline of Cape Melville. In 96 hours time on the Saturday we see the system has now entered the coastline around Cape Melville, and then as we head to day 5 we see the system washes out here over the peninsula but creates moderate to heavy rainfall. Once again that area from St. Lawrence northwards will see some very heavy rainfall from this type of scenario where the system just washes out over northern inland Queensland. Alright, so if we have a look at the CMC, the Canadian CMC model ensemble, we can see that there's been a big change here since yesterday. Yesterday the Canadian CMC had the system pushing west into the Gulf. Some of the model members actually had it pushing to NT. We've now seen every single one of its model members have decided that the system will recurve. Now, most of that guidance suggests that the system will recurve as per the Bureau of Meteorology. So the system will track to the west-southwest and then just a very sharp recurve, but well and truly after landfall. So there's no real threat of a strong TC heading down the coast. It's more of a case of a monsoonal low then, or a tropical low, creating some very, very heavy rainfall over northern and central Queensland as it tracks southwards. So that's where the CMC has changed its tune big time. Still looking at a Friday landfall from the CMC, and we are still looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 outliers of the 20 odd that it has there, suggesting that the system will remain offshore. And if that does happen, obviously we're looking at a TC, still a TC intensity system out here if it remains offshore. We take a look at the UK Met model. The UK Met model is all over the shop, so there's very little confidence in either in any scenario from the UK Met model, even it's deterministic. And normally the UK Met model is pretty good, and it is one of the go-to models. And we see that overall the UK Met model pushes the system directly west, followed by a more southwest option just before landfall, hits the coast around the Friday mark. But remember that the UK Met model also has the system just washing out here over the southern peninsula. And we also have outliers from the UK model suggesting that it will push into the Gulf of Carpentaria and then start pushing in a more southerly direction. We even have a couple of outliers that suggest that it could even go as far as Gove or Nhulunbuy. But look, those outliers also suggest that it's going to hit the Torres Strait, which seems very, very unlikely at this point in time. So I would discount these two outliers and focus in more on these options here. There is still that option of the system not making landfall at all, so a couple of model members are still suggesting that. The GFS is in very, very tight agreement that the system will hit the coast around Cape Melville or just to the south, and then will track right along the coast. Now, whether it tracks offshore or onshore is all important, folks, and I can't tell you which one of those is going to come off because it's so tight and it's so tough to call. If one of these inland options comes off, once again we're looking at a tropical low. I guess the biggest threat with that will be the heavy rainfall to the southeast of wherever the low is at that point in time, and also those isolated tornado threats in some very, very strong lower level turning of the atmosphere. Also, the other options out here, it's about 50-50 split at the moment with the GFS, so the other 50% options are suggesting it will be just off the coast, and if that happens, well, then we're going to see a tropical cyclone intensity system, probably in the vicinity of Cat 2 or 3, pushing southwards along or just near the coastline, and once again, that is a worst case scenario for the Queensland coast. So here is the upper level high that is developing over Queensland and the Coral Sea. Now that upper level high is expected to align itself east to west, and so we're expecting to see that tropical low, or tropical cyclone Ida, will track in a westerly direction. Remembering that the track, or the mean level flow in the mid levels of the atmosphere, is towards the west northwest. However, cyclones will always track just south of the mean mid-level flow. Now, if we look at the out here in the far eastern Coral Sea, we have an upper-level trough which is going to try and push the system away from the Queensland coast. That's not going to achieve that's not going to achieve success there because it's too far to the east. This upper-level high is becoming entrenched now over northern Queensland. So by tomorrow we actually see what I'm talking about here, how the high aligns or orients itself from east to west as opposed to what it is today, and because of that we see a track more towards the west or west-southwest developing tomorrow. We can also see this upper trough here now not having much of an effect at all on the cyclone. As we head into Thursday morning, we can continue to see this upper level high cradling the system into the coastline. So by Thursday morning, the system's well and truly on its southwesterly track. And just when you think everything's all set and all done, the upper level high completely vanishes. And on Friday, we are left with a tropical cyclone that is tinkering and teetering and not knowing where it's going over the Cape York Peninsula region in this entire area here. So folks, this situation then becomes very complex on Friday. Just when you really need things to be clear cut, it gets as complex as possible. So the system now has, by Friday morning, either made landfall or approaching landfall, and at that time there is no steering influence on the system. There is nothing guiding it anywhere. So persistence is one of the tools that forecasters use when continuing to look at general movement. So once the steering levels break down, the system will continue to try, a tropical cyclone will continue to try pushing in a similar direction to the way it was pushing in the past 12 to 18 hours. However, without a clear steering mechanism, that direction of movement starts to become a little bit more poleward. So all that means in English is that while we'll continue to see more than likely a westerly movement, it's likely to become a bit more southerly. So it's more likely to be a southwesterly or south-southwesterly movement at that point in time. So as we head to Saturday morning, though, things start to become a little bit clearer. We start to get an amplifying, what am I doing there? An amplifying upper level trough here over the central part of Australia. And we also have an upper level high developing here over Fiji and Vanuatu, and the combination of those systems will start to result in a southeasterly mean steering flow. So you can see these arrows pushing around these systems. So you should start to see the system, wherever it's located, in the Gulf or over the peninsula or near the Queensland coast, start to push in a southeasterly direction on Saturday. And by Sunday we continue to see that same movement pattern likely here, with the upper level high over Fiji heading west into the Coral Sea now, and the system located on the western edge of that, so it's now very likely to be pushing in a southeasterly direction by Sunday. So folks, unfortunately the issue we have is Friday, the day that everything happens. We have no clear guidance from any of the computer models as to what's going to happen on that day and what's going to guide the system. And that's the one day we really need the models. It's the one day they're showing us nothing. They're giving us nothing. And that's why we're struggling to see exactly what's going to happen at landfall and post landfall of the system. So we can tell you now for the next couple of days it's going to push towards the coast. No, very little doubt about that. But what we can't tell you is what's going to happen on D-Day, Friday. We just don't know. There's nothing to tell us either way what's going to happen. And that's why we have such a big disagreement in the longer term track between the Bureau of Meteorology, the Joint Typhoon Warning Centre. I hope I've made that clearer. Let's have a quick look at rainfall potential. On Thursday, we see the tropical and far northern Queensland coastline starting to see some increasing shower activity. On Thursday is when Cyclone chasers expect to be on the road and hitting the Cape York Peninsula. So up until then, we should have fairly clear driving conditions. However, Thursday afternoon, evening, we start to see some increasing rainfall potential, especially some heavy falls developing in the northern Cape and also the exposed parts of the North Tropical Coast and Tropical Coast of Queensland. The trough system over South Australia, WA and T starts to weaken. We still see some very good rainfall here in the Victorian and South Australian region, and we continue to see some isolated shower and storm activity here over the North Kimberley western top end. On Friday, we start to see some very heavy falls of rain developing along the coastal section of the Cape, the North Tropical Coast, anywhere north of about Townsville, expecting some very heavy rainfall, particularly so north of Cairns. We're going to see falls of possibly 200 to 300 millimetres in parts in that 24-hour period, so that's quite intense rainfall there. Now, we see that rainfall extending way out here to the west in the Gulf and also way down south towards Townsville. Now, that's because, once again, once Friday happens, we don't have very good guidance on where the cyclone will go, and so because of that, we have quite a large model spread in the area of intense rainfall. So do take this with a grain of salt, and it will depend on the forecast track and position and location of tropical cyclone Ita on Friday as to which one comes off, or which area of enhanced rainfall comes off, whether Weipa gets enhanced rainfall or whether the area between Cairns and Townsville gets enhanced rainfall. And you see that even more clearly on Saturday, as we see this big area of intense rain in the Gulf, or we see this huge area of intense rain between Cairns and around about Bowen. And because of that, once again, we do need to be mindful that it all depends on where Ita will go. We see some very isolated activity also over the top end coastline. So if you live north of Mackay, you're going to see a very, very wet week ahead. And once again, though, dependent on the exact track of the system, will depend on whether you get the 400mm possible falls or whether you get the 100mm possible falls. And we can't give you too much guidance on that because it all depends what happens Friday. So we've been very, very clear on this, folks. We can't give you any more guidance other than the fact to tell you that the system will approach the peninsular coastline. What it does as it approaches, as it's about to hit, we can't tell you, and that will determine where this really, really huge amounts of rainfall will fall. Thanks for watching tonight. It's been a long one. It's been a very interesting one. I hope we'll talk again tomorrow. Good night.